All right, good morning, everybody. Let's begin with a couple of announcements here. Remember that your next homework assignment isn't due until tomorrow at 5. And here's an announcement that our next class meeting for Tuesday of next week, it's not going to be here in the classroom. I'm going to be down in Clemson working on the Fundamentals of Engineering exam. And so our class will just be a video that's posted online. I'll email you with a PDF of the in-class exercise that goes with that lecture. And so what I'll ask you to do is watch the lecture, solve the in-class exercise, and then bring the paper to class a week from today, because I'm going to give you in-class exercise points. You know, those count towards the homework assignments when I collect them. I'll be collecting the Tuesday paper from you on Thursday. That make sense to everybody? All right. Now, the other announcement I wanted to kind of refresh your memory, put the thought in the back of your mind, is that you've got a project that I've given you, the handout from the project, and I've received 0 questions so far about the project. And I kind of know how much people are working on the project by the volume of questions I receive. And so my suggestion is over the weekend you should do that Getting Started handout. Once you have that Getting Started handout completed, then the whole rest of the project just falls into place really neatly. And I know that sometimes the hardest thing in a big assignment is just, you know, doing the first bit of work. You know, it seems so overwhelming you don't even know where to begin. And so that's why I created this first little nugget of work for you to do. That Getting Started portion of the assignment will kind of head you in the right direction. And so please get an early start on that. You'll just be doing yourself a favor if you don't wait to the last minute for the project. Any questions about the announcements? Okay, we're going to do one last form of incremental analysis where we're going to be trying to determine rates of return and compare alternatives. That's on an annual basis. And then we're going to shift gears completely and start talking about project evaluation for situations where there's no profit. There's a lot of projects out there in the world that aren't necessarily designed to maximize profits, and so we'll discuss how you can choose alternatives if they all lose money. So let's talk about annual worth. Now you remember that when we were doing our analysis previously, there was the present worth method where you're trying to decide if something's acceptable by discounting all of its cash flows to the present using the MAR. And then the decision criteria when you were doing present worth analysis was if the present worth is greater than 0 when you've discounted everything at the MAR, then that means the project's potentially acceptable. Future worth method was the same kind of thing. It's just we were compounding all of the cash flows to the future, and then if the sum of the cash flows at some future date was positive, then that means the project's acceptable. Annual worth analysis was where we were taking not only the present value, but also any kind of salvage value at the end of an item's useful life, and then we're also including the recurring annual costs, and then we were looking to see if on an annual basis are the revenues greater or are the costs greater. So that's your previous exposure to annual worth analysis. When we did annual worth analysis, remember that there was an assumption built in. And it's automatically assumed when you do annual worth analysis that cash flows are repeatable. If you're comparing alternatives that have different useful lives, the nice thing, just to refresh your memory, the nice thing about annual worth analysis was that you didn't have to manually apply LCM. Remember the least common multiple idea where you're trying to sync up different duration cash flows and make them terminate at the same year? Well, annual worth analysis, when you do it, automatically assumes that. It automatically assumes that these alternatives of different useful lives, you're just planning to repeat them. Okay, so now sometimes you want to compare alternatives on the basis of their annual worth, and beyond that, you don't want to just know which one is better, because you've already seen that. The one that's better is the one that has the most annual worth. Sometimes what you want to know and understand is what is the rate of return on the difference. Remember that the word increment, which we talked about on Tuesday, means the difference between two alternatives. And so when we calculate the increment, we're looking at the difference in the initial cost, the difference in the salvage value, the difference in the annual operating costs. And then you're trying to calculate, is the rate of return on the additional amount greater than the MAR? So that's the decision criteria on this incremental analysis. And so sometimes what we want to know is, like, if we were going to be buying computer equipment, just as an illustration. You know, computer equipment has to be replaced so often that sometimes organizations just allocate a fixed amount every year to go towards their computer purchases. You know, rather than having a lump sum every 3 years, what they do is they annualize those costs. Even if they're in a position where they don't necessarily need to lease equipment, it's just easier on an operating basis to consider that expense as constant rather than having an irregular expense. People do the same thing with insurance. Lots of folks can pay the full 6 months or the full year of an insurance bill all at once, but just because it's simpler, they have a monthly payment just to smooth out the expense. And so computer equipment, you can buy a laptop all at once, or you can buy a cell phone all at once, or you can do the monthly payments. I think T-Mobile was the first one that kind of pioneered the idea of it's not necessarily a subsidy, it's just they're going to allow you to work the cost of the phone into your monthly bill. So what we want to know sometimes is the rate of return on the additional investment required. Remember, the additional investment required, that's a way of saying the increment between the two. So what we're going to do to solve for what is that rate of return is we're going to find out which interest rate is it that makes the two annual worths of the options equal. So that's the solution strategy, is we're going to have to guess some value of this interest rate and then see if we have this as the interest rate, does it make the two annual worths equal? And if not, we keep changing the interest rate over and over again until between the two options, the two annual worths are equal. So why would they be equal? Well, it's because they're going to have different initial costs, different salvage values, and different operating costs. And so there is some interest rate out there that will bring them into equilibrium. And then that will tell us what's the rate of return on the one that requires an additional amount. And then down here at the bottom, I have this asterisk. When we use this method, it implies repeatability. So any questions so far about the approach? So as you expect, we're going to do some hands-on today. Everybody bring a computer to class. I see lots of them already. What we're going to do is I have a handout that shows the template that you're going to need to follow to solve this problem. Let's just look at the comparison here. We have a couple of front-end loaders. One of them is a bobcat, the other is a cat. Option A is $8,000 as an initial cost, and it has an annual cost of $3,500. It'll last for 10 years with no salvage value. Option B, ironically, costs more, and it's going to last half as long. So it has a greater initial cost, a shorter lifespan, but a much lower annual cost. So what we need to do is we need to find the annual worth of each option. And so the initial cost, that is a present value. And so option A, if we're going to draw a cash flow diagram, option A looks like we spend $8,000 in year 0. So that's a present of $8,000. And then every year for 10 years, we have a cost of $3,500. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And every year, there's a consistent amount of $3,500 that's these operating costs. So A equals $3,500. Okay, so how do we find the annual worth of option A? What do we have to do? There's one thing right now that's not annualized. Yeah, so the 8,000. So what factor would we use if we were going to do it on paper? What factor would we use to turn this present value into an equivalent annual amount? Good. So find A given P for I equals, we don't know, and then N equals 10. Now the I equals we don't know, that's what we're going to be solving for, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be, on the one hand, playing around with the annual worth of option A, and then on the other hand, playing around with the annual worth of option B, and we're going to try and make it so that there's some interest rate that makes the two annual worths equal. And so let's look at what the cash flow diagram for option B looks like. We have an initial cost of 13,000. We've got an annual worth, an annual cost, 5 expenses at 1,600. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1,600 for each of them. So A equals 1,600. And then there is a salvage here. So that's a future value is 2,000. So here we've got the 13,000 that we're going to have to do if we're doing it on paper. And A slash P, I equals unknown, N equals 5. And then this future value, we would do find A given F, I equals unknown, N equals 5. Okay, so that's your conceptualization of it, kind of the paper way. And what we would be doing is, let's say we'd start with 1%. We'd find out what is the total annual worth of option A at 1%. So we're going to find the sum of the annual worth of option A at blank percent is what? So then we do the same thing for option B. The annual worth, the sum of the annual worth of option B at blank percent is what? What we're trying to do is we're trying to find some interest rate that makes the two annual worths equal. So we're going to have kind of a goal seek. Our goal is that there's no difference between the two annual worths. And so you think in terms of, remember how a goal seek works? You tell the computer, set this equal to that, some number. So what we're going to do is we're going to have this field minus this field is equal to 0. So that'll be our goal, is we want the difference between the two annual worths to be 0 by changing the interest rate. Okay, let me give you this handout. And what you can do, once you have the handout, is first of all, start formatting your file so that you've got all of the blanks and all of the descriptions and all the column titles like I've provided. All right, so first things first, make your spreadsheet look like this. Now, you don't have to have all of the italics and the bold and the like the cell borders and everything. That's not necessarily important, but you just basically have these labels, the same basic order, and then we're going to go through these steps A through G. And I think that will help you to see what's the process for finding the rate of return on the increment. There's no template available for download. I'm going to have you type this one in manually. In Excel, remember the function that you can use to find what is the annual equivalent of the initial cost? That's the function PMT. So the PMT function is how you can find out the recurring equivalent of some initial cost. All right, so which option is better, option A or option B? Which one should we select? B. Why? Why should we select option B? Okay, good, good. So in the handout, it says that at the bottom of the page, you must choose option A or option B. If your company's MAR is 9%, which is best? And so our analysis told us that the more expensive option, option B, the incremental rate of return is 12.65%, because when we set the two annual worths equal to each other with the goal seek we want the difference to be 0. So what I'm going to do is my data, what if analysis, goal seek, and our objective is set the difference between the two annual costs to 0 by changing this guess interest rate. Okay, so 12.65%. So the rate of return on the extra cost for option B is 12.65. So then down here I'm going to put, since the MAR is 9%, we should select option B. The rate of return on the incremental cost is greater than the MAR. The rule is keep spending money as long as the rate of return on that money exceeds your minimum acceptable rate of return. So why is option B better? If it doesn't last as long and it is more expensive, the reason why it's better is that the annual cost is so much lower. And so it's worth trying to get those savings in the annual cost. You pay a little bit more up front and you save more on an annual basis, because what we found is that the two have the same annual basis when the interest rate between them is 12.6%. So the way that we interpret that, be sure and type this conclusion into your spreadsheet, because it's not just enough on a test to calculate the number. You have to be able to interpret what that number means and apply it to decision making. Remember, that's the whole point of the course, is to be able to make economic decisions and compare alternatives and select the one that's best. So option B is better because you earn more on the incremental cost than your minimum. All right, be sure and save your file. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, I'm a little confused on how you choose option B is better.
Well, it's a given. On the handout it said your MAR is 9%. And so we can tell just by inspection that the option B is more expensive. Like if you look at the annual equivalent of the initial cost, option B is more than twice as much on the annual cost basis. But then it's so much lower on the annual expense basis. Like if we annualize the initial cost, it's higher, but then there's a savings on the recurring. That may be fuel costs, maybe it's maintenance, maybe it's how much the equipment costs to insure. There's just something about this option B that makes the annual costs lower. And then when you find the rate of return that makes the two annual worths equal, what that essentially does is it tells you how much extra are you earning on the difference between them. Because we're setting the difference to 0. And if I go back to this image from our previous lecture, that might help to illustrate it. Remember in this one, we're saying that there's some crossover point between the two options. Well, what we were doing is we were finding out when we make it so that the two options are equal, what is the interest rate that has that crossover point. And the definition of that crossover point, where we could use any interest rate to discount the amounts to the present or to the future, or even looking at it on an annual basis. And so we can use any interest rate we want, but there is some magical interest rate out there that makes the two curves intersect, and that happens to be the rate of return on the increment. So basically, in this case, when we found this interest rate that makes the two amounts equal to each other, then that's the rate of return on the increment. And the increment, by definition, is the difference in the costs. So your boss, he would say, option B, that equipment looks more expensive. Is it worth doing if our MAR is 9%? And you'd be able to say, yes, it's worth doing because the rate of return on the increment is greater than the MAR. 12.65 is more than 9, so we should do this option B equipment. Are there other questions about this in-class exercise? All right. So far, we've kind of had a one-track mind in this course. We've been focusing almost exclusively on ways to maximize profit. You can see these guys have these real enthusiastic looks on their faces because they know the great truth of the world is money is all that matters, right? As long as you just maximize the amount of money coming into your pocket, then everything else just takes care of itself. Of course, we know that that's not really true. There's not only more to life than maximizing profits, but there's more to economics than maximizing profits. Particularly in cases where there are a lot of projects out there that don't have any profits and yet they're still worth doing. There are some projects out there that only have costs and don't generate economic returns that are positive, but they have some other benefit that allows us to say, yeah, we should do it even though it's not maximizing profits. So that's where we're headed next, is we're headed to learn some tools so that you can evaluate projects that are money-losing projects. But still, you're going to have choices. You're going to have option A and option B, and you're going to try and choose the project that's the best among the ones that are all losing money, because there's some important reason to do it. And maybe in the case of food aid, for example, giving food to starving people doesn't maximize profits, and yet there are organizations out there that work really tirelessly to do that. In the case of roadway safety, think about the expense of installing guardrails. Guardrails are really costly. There's a lot of steel there. Galvanized steel isn't cheap. The trouble of installing it alongside a road, but it saves lives, and society has decided it's worth spending more on improving a road in order to save the value of the human life that otherwise might be lost in a roadway accident. So that's another illustration of it's more than just profits that matter. Anybody know what this is? Let me dim the lights so maybe the picture's a little bit easier to see. Okay, why do you say that? Why do you say there's probably a residential area on the other side? Okay, yeah, he's absolutely right. This is a noise wall. And so another expensive feature to put alongside a road, and if all you were caring about was maximizing profits, the truck that's driving alongside that road, they're not going to get to the destination any quicker because of the noise wall. But it really improves the quality of life for people that live in the vicinity because truck traffic can be so noisy. I live about 2 miles from Interstate 64, and during the winter I can hear the freeway. During the summer, not so much because the leaves kind of do the job of deflecting the sound. But during the winter time, it's noisy, and I'm 2 miles away. I can't believe that there are some people that just live right off the interstate. Man, that boggles my mind. And it's not like we have these noise walls around here either. But in a lot of places they do because they've decided that it's worth spending money to have that improvement in quality of life. Here's a picture of people who are, they have no other option but to consume, bathe, to use really polluted, dirty water. And so You know, how do you maximize profits? You just throw your waste wherever you want. That's how you maximize profits, because recycling costs extra money. I pay about $21 a month to have my garbage picked up, but there are some people out where I live, they don't want to pay that, and so they just burn the garbage in their front yard, you know? And so then the smoke goes everywhere, and I guess probably there's some health hazards associated with that, but it's not always about the money, is the point. Is we can sometimes do things that do maximize profits and really suffer a reduced quality of life from it, or sometimes we can do things that cost a little extra and it minimizes the profits slightly, but we decide there's some sort of a social benefit that's worth the investment. So let's talk about those types of projects that don't always turn a profit. Here's a big list of public sector projects where they are financed at a higher level than a private company. They're financed by the citizens, and a government organizes or at least pays for many of these kinds of projects. And so if you think about highways, bridges, waterways like the Ohio River, where a lot of cost is put into maintaining the navigability of the river and ensuring that the locks and dams are in good condition so that barge traffic can go up and downstream. Parks and recreation, you know, if we wanted to maximize profits, then we would sell the parks and put in subdivisions, especially in a place like New York City. You know, Central Park in the middle of Manhattan, that real estate is worth billions, if not trillions of dollars. And yet, the city of New York's made the decision that they value having some green space in an urban area, and so the land is just left open. People don't have to pay admission to use Central Park. You just go there and use it as much as you want. But that's an illustration of a public sector project that isn't necessarily maximizing profits. A lot of times, things like utilities are public sector projects, and sometimes there are for-profit companies that manage utilities. Like here in this area, our water is provided by West Virginia American Water. Our electricity is provided by AEP. But there are some cities where the water is provided by the city and the electricity is provided by the city. Now, generally speaking, those cities have lower utility rates than we do here. Because the city isn't necessarily trying to maximize profits, but the private companies kind of, they want profits more than a city would. So there's lots of things where they may be money losing or they're done for reasons beyond just maximizing profits. So airports is a good illustration. Having an airport can bring economic vibrancy to a community that wouldn't exist if it didn't have an airport. And Atlanta is a perfect example of that. The Atlanta airport is the busiest airport in the world, and it's part of the reason why Atlanta is such a booming town is that there's a lot of jobs at the airport. Having lots of flights in and out of the city connects the city to other places in the country and across the world, and so it makes it easier to do business in Atlanta when you can arrive there quickly and conveniently and for a low cost. And so sometimes these projects are undertaken to promote business ability. And so if you think about highways, anybody get stuck in traffic last night? I definitely did. There was an accident on the interstate. You maybe heard about it. I think there was like an 8-car pileup, and it's unfortunate there was a fatality, but still, I don't understand why I don't just shove all those cars off to the side and then we can keep driving, right? But it was like the freeway was shut down for, I think, more than 8 hours. It was really jammed up. But when the highways are working well, it allows for a lot more economic vibrancy than if the highways weren't working. Like if you think back to the days in America where goods moved by barge, it was more costly, and economic growth was a lot slower than nowadays that there are highways. And so the highway itself may not be generating money in a direct way, but indirectly it can contribute to economic growth and vibrancy. And so that's why sometimes these projects are undertaken, is that the project itself doesn't earn money, but it allows other people to be successful because of it. So the purpose of a public sector project is to provide a service to the citizenry for the public good at no profit. So let's compare and contrast what types of projects are public versus what types of projects are private. A public project generally has a longer lifespan than a private project. And the reason why that's the case is that a private project, if the objective is to generate profits, remember the long term is the enemy of profits, because any revenue in the future is going to have less effect because it's so far in the future and we have to discount it, and compounding so many years, those future profits aren't worth very much today. And so it's difficult to finance a long-term project if your objective is maximizing profits. So public projects, as a result, if you're not as focused on maximizing revenue, then it enables you to do the types of projects that have a longer lifespan. So like the Golden Gate Bridge is more than 100 years old. And it was a public project. And part of the reason why a big project like that can be undertaken is that they're not trying to cover their investment in the short term. They do it because they know that it's good for society and it's good for overall economic growth, but maybe they're not generating the same kind of profits that a private company could accept. And so the annual cash flow for a public project is not necessarily going to be positive, whereas a private company is looking for a profit-driven cash flow. A private company is going to finance its projects the ways that we've already talked about, stocks and bonds, maybe loans from banks. Public entities have other sources of revenues that a company doesn't. The government can charge taxes. The government can charge fees. Here in Huntington, we have the city user fee. Anyone who works in Huntington has to pay, I think, like $10 a month as a user fee. And that's in addition to the taxes that people who live in Huntington pay, like on property and so on. Public entities can raise money through bonds. There are municipal bonds, state bonds, federal bonds that get sold to finance big projects. The public, because governments are able to borrow money at lower interest rates than companies, because governments are more secure than companies are, because a government has the legal right to tax an economy. And so that's, I mean, it's going to be able to repay its debts because the federal government, for example, has the authority to tax people that are inside the United States. And so the federal government can borrow money at a lower interest rate than private companies because there's less risk of default. The U.S. government has never defaulted on its bonds, and so the bond rates are relatively low. Now, one of the most important things is down here towards the bottom, selection criteria. So whether to choose option A or option B for the private company, it's just all about maximizing profits and finding the rate of return on the increment. In the case of a public project, it's multiple decisions that go into which alternative is selected. It's not just about maximizing revenue, but it could be other issues like the environment, the effect of noise, the effect of pollution, minimizing delay. There's just so many different stakeholders that there has to be a political process for choosing alternatives. There are public meetings that are held. And it's not necessarily just an economic decision, like is for the case of a private company, but when big projects are undertaken, like airports or roads or bridges or like hospitals, then it's a process that takes a whole range of factors into account. Now, one thing to keep in the back of our minds is that if the government is spending money, it has to take the money away from the people. And so that's kind of the incentive for maximizing efficiency that we have to be working towards, is that you probably would have spent your dollar in a way that is more valuable to you than the government is. And so, we can all agree that the government serves an important role, that certain things the government can do no one else could do, like protecting the country, or providing police, or maybe public schools, or roadways. There are certain things that the government is going to be best at, but then we could take that to an extreme that's counterproductive, because the private enterprise is better at doing some things than the government is, like providing food and providing goods that are sold in stores. If you go to places where the government is the sole source of food and goods, my brother visited Cuba this year, and he said, man, it was a depressing place with horrible food. He couldn't have a good meal the whole time he was down in Cuba because there's just so little private enterprise down there, there's no incentive to work. Because the government takes away so much of the people's money that they figure, well, I just won't work, and I'll just rely on the government handouts. And so it's kind of a depressing place in his recounting. In contrast, here in the United States, most of the economic activity is driven by private enterprise, and a smaller fraction of the economy is the public service. And so in any case, just keep in mind that we want to do good things that are good for society, but that's going to be at the expense of taking people's money away. Okay, so the first way that we're going to learn how to evaluate projects is a method called benefit cost. So here, B/C, that stands for benefit to cost. And it's a ratio that is trying to answer the question, are the benefits greater than the costs for a certain project? One of the tricky things of this method is going to be that we have to assign dollar values to things that don't naturally lend themselves to being quantified in an economic way. So we have to monetize each project effect and classify it as a benefit, disbenefit, or cost. So here's our definitions for each. A benefit is an advantage to the public. A disbenefit is a disadvantage. And then costs are the direct outlays, or the expenditures. Okay, so look at the types of things that are classified as benefits. Time savings, improved reliability, enhanced safety, environmental protection, leisure opportunities. So if we're trying to decide whether to put in a bridge somewhere, like if someone was proposing a fourth bridge between Huntington and Ohio, then what we would do is we would try and quantify the advantages in an economic sense. So you'd look at the value of people's time that is going to be saved for crossing the river. You know, if there's delay that's going to be avoided, then you can multiply the value of someone's time by the delay that's avoided. Improved reliability or enhanced safety. You know, there is a dollar value that has to be assigned to a human life, for example. And so if putting guardrails alongside a road is going to reduce a certain number of deaths each year, then you try and say, what's the economic value of that? And it's not necessarily the people who would have died are paying, but we're just using the dollars as a consistent way of measuring all of these things. And the same thing is true of these disadvantages. We try and quantify on a dollar basis the expense of delay, damage, the decreased value of assets. So noise, for example, you have to try and calculate what's the economic impact of me hearing the freeway. You know, if we put up those noise barriers, we try and find out, is it valuable to do it? Is there more benefit than cost? Well, how much would you be willing to pay to reduce the noise would be maybe one way of quantifying that disbenefit. So when we find this ratio, I'm going to show you the formula in just a minute for calculating the benefit to cost. All of the terms have to be expressed consistently, either in the present, on an annual worth basis, or in the future. So not only do we have to take everything into dollars, but then it also has to be in the same time frame. Another note here is that we're already assuming that costs are outlays of cash, and so you don't use a minus sign inside of the benefit cost fraction. And then savings to the government are subtracted from costs. When big projects are undertaken, sometimes private companies participate in that. And so here in West Virginia, occasionally road projects like paving and culverts are done by state employees, and sometimes those roadway projects are done by contractors. And there are different ways to bring a contractor in on a public project. And sometimes they'll just have a fixed price type contract where for a lump sum payment someone is agreeing to do a certain amount of work. In other cases, someone will be reimbursed for the costs that they incur plus some additional amount to give them profits. In this first case, either one of these, the contractor doesn't have any risk. They're basically keeping all of the risk with the private entity, with the government. But there's this new trend in projects called public-private partnerships. And this new trend is trying to make it so that the contractors have an incentive to do good work, and they have an incentive to finish their work on time, and that there are economic consequences if they don't do what they've agreed to. And so two of the types of public-private partnerships that have arisen are design-build projects where a contractor is not only building the item, but from the very beginning is responsible for designing it. And the advantage of that is that sometimes during a fixed price or cost reimbursable project, the designer and the person who's building a project are two different groups, and they don't communicate as well as they should. And the engineers point at the contractor, and the contractor points at the engineers, and they kind of blame each other, but it creates inefficiencies. In the case of a design-build, if it's one integrated team that is both designing the project and building it, then that improves the communication, and when there are inefficiencies, it's on them, and it's not going to be the additional cost or expenses incurred by the government. Even more kind of new and sophisticated is the idea that the private entity will design, build, operate, maintain, and finance a project. And that's an example of that here on campus is the rec center. And all of you pay fees each semester to have access to the MU rec. But what you may not know is that the university actually doesn't own that building. The university doesn't operate that building. Basically, what they agreed to, as I understand it, is the university gave a contract to a private company and said, if you build this rec center, then we'll give you the right to operate it for 20 years, and we're going to force our students to pay a fee. And you can have this guaranteed stream of revenue for 20 years, but then at the end of the 20 years, the building is ours, and you have to walk away. And so the university didn't have to pay anything to build the rec. All they had to do is they had to agree that the students are forced to pay a fee to support the rec center. And so that was kind of like a good deal for Marshall because they got some nice building without any outlay of cash. It's a good deal for the company because they have guaranteed customers. They don't have to advertise really. They just know that they're going to have a certain number of students signing up. I guess the only group it's not necessarily good for is people who have to pay the fee but don't actually use the rec. Maybe it's not convenient for you. Maybe you have a different gym that you prefer, and then you end up paying for something that you don't necessarily want. But it's an illustration of how sometimes a government agency like a university and private companies can team up to do a project. Here's the formula for a conventional benefit cost analysis. The decision criteria is that if this ratio is above 1, that means to accept the project. If it's less than 1, you reject the project. So let's look at what we're saying, what's in this ratio. In the numerator is the benefits minus the disbenefits. So remember, disbenefits are the types of things that are maybe, like noise, pollution, delay. Benefits are the economic advantages of the project. And then in the denominator here is the sum of the initial construction cost and the maintenance and operation costs. Now, the initial costs are usually present values, and maintenance and operation are usually annual recurring costs, and so we have to take it to the same time frame to be able to combine these amounts together. In other words, everything has to be in the present or the future or in an annual basis, but we can't add them together unless all those dollars are in the same year. There is a slightly different formula where in the modified benefit cost ratio, we put the maintenance and operation costs up in the numerator and we subtract them from the benefits. So that's just another way of looking at how much bigger the benefits are than the costs. There's also something called the profitability index, and the profitability index is from the perspective of the contractor who is participating in the project, because this benefit cost ratio takes into account the benefits to society, and a contractor isn't necessarily interested in the benefits to society as much as as much as the government is. And the other factor is that in the case of a private contractor, the disbenefits are being suffered by someone else. So sometimes the profitability index is calculated on projects like toll roads, where there are economic benefits that are going to go to whoever is designing, building, and operating a toll road. But the disbenefits, like the noise or any kind of delay associated with when the construction project is being first built, the contractor isn't suffering those disbenefits, and so they're kept out of the equation. All right, on the back side of the handout that I gave you is a series of questions just to give you some practice doing benefit cost analysis. So what we have is a scenario where a new highway is under consideration, and the government's going to partner with a private company to actually complete the project. So we're looking at a study period of 20 years, and this project is going to take a few years to actually build. And so it says that the construction costs are $4 million now, $18 million each year in years 1 through 4, and then $4 million in year 5. So in the formula for benefit cost analysis, one of the factors is going to be the C sub I, the initial construction costs. And so here, our initial construction costs are going to all need to go to the present. So that's what I'm asking you to do in Part A. Part B is find the present worth of the maintenance and maintenance costs, maintenance and operation. So you see here it's $1 million each year for 20 years. So you have to take that to the present. Part C is find the present worth of the benefits, and you can see from the description here the estimated revenue and benefits are spread out over time. So find the present worth of that, and then do the same thing for the disbenefits. And once you have each of these individual factors, you'll be able to calculate the conventional B2C and the modified B2C and the profitability index. So I'll paste those formulas onto, well, I guess I'll leave them up on the screen here because you've got the handout in front of you. All right, so to find the initial costs, there's already the $4 million that's at the present, and then we find the present value of the $18 million per year, and then we find the present value of this single $4 million that's out at year 5, and so the sum of the initial costs are $72.6 million, and then we find the present value of the maintenance and operation costs, and that's $1 million a year for 20 years. We find that $13.59 million. The benefits, we do the same thing. We find out what's the present value of the benefits, what's the present value of the disbenefits, and then when we go through it all, we're able to calculate the B to C ratio by having all of the benefits minus all of the disbenefits divided by the initial cost plus the maintenance and operation costs. Now, we're out of time for now, so what I'm going to suggest is hold on to this paper. We'll continue finishing up this in-class exercise when we get together a week from today. Because remember, class that is next Tuesday. Actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll I'll finish showing you this solution in the video. That might be the most streamlined way to do it. So just to reiterate these announcements here, remember that we don't have a physical class meeting on Tuesday of next week. That's going to be a recorded lecture. And then homework is due tomorrow by 5. All right. Have a great day. I'll see you later.